everybody. Welcome to the Happy Dog Online. Welcome to Happy Dog Takes on the World. I hope you are having a hot dog at home. I've got mine, courtesy of Mike Sobek. And I wanted to say a special thanks to our partners, especially the City Club, for making this possible. We are eagerly hoping to come back when it's safe. But in the meantime, we love being with you, and we wouldn't have been able to do that without the City Club. I also want to mention our other great partners in this series, the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle East Studies and the Cleveland Council on World Affairs. And of course, IdeaStream in the form of our illustrious moderator, Tony Ganzer. We are especially pleased to have with us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tony and thank everyone for tuning in, and we will see you at the Happy Dog soon.
That's awesome. Thanks, Sean. First things first. You can't hear it, but it's definitely gonging. Thanks so much, everybody being here. I rushed from the studio for this event, so it'll be great. We'll make do with what we have. Just going to read a few remarks here. Hello and welcome to the first ever Happy Dog Takes on the World virtually online. I am Tony Ganzer, host and producer for 90.3 WCPN IdeaStream, the NPR station for Northeast Ohio. The coronavirus pandemic has disrupted life across the globe, profoundly affecting supply chains, healthcare, the economy. It's also exposed the harsh realities of racial, ethnic, economic, political, and health disparities, the effects of which many countries have tried to minimize or ignore for decades. This isn't new. Now, as the pandemic slows before a probable second wave, global leaders and governments are weighing options and contemplating decisions that will define history and shape the world for years to come. As in every City Club forum, you can participate with your questions, and we hope that you do. I have a window open now, eagerly waiting them to come in. You can text them to the number 330-541-5794. That number again, and it's on the screen, 330-541-5794. You can also tweet them at the City Club, all one term, and we'll work them in best we can. So to introduce our illustrious panelists for the first ever virtual forum, Dr. Shanna Marshall, Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies at the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Walid Haspoun, Dr. Walid Haspoun, the Richard L. Chambers Professor of Middle Eastern Studies in the Department of Political Science at the University of Alabama. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
And Milena Sterio, the Charles R. Emmerich Jr., Kulfi Halter, and Griswold Professor of Law at Cleveland Marshall College of Law. I hope I got all the names in. Welcome.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, you did.
All right, excellent. And one thing we want to mention about Drs. Marshall and Haspoun is you're appearing as editors of the Middle East Report, and you can follow that at MERIP online on Twitter or merip.org for that work. To start this conversation, this is such a broad topic. We can go in many directions, and maybe we will, who knows. But I wonder if each of you, starting maybe with Dr. Haspoun, can talk about maybe one thing you think really will change or won't change as a result of the pandemic. You can go either way, buyer's choice here, about this pandemic.
One thing that will change for sure, I mean, some of the obvious things are, just the economic impact, I think, on the United States, on the global economy, and how this is dealt with. So I think just this is not so much like I think will it will not change. It's just this issue of there's going to be this problem of how do we respond to this crisis, and how are the different responses around the world. So I do kind of fear that we're at this moment that's exaggerating the drift towards nationalism, towards fragmentation between different states, the erosion of international norms, international order, that has seen a cycle of, especially in the Middle East, sort of expanded conflict. At the same time that the U.S. is doesn't have major, I mean, we could talk about this, but doesn't have major interest or threats in the region. I mean, relative to the Cold War and in previous eras. So one kind of issue is the global concern for these kinds of issues, like global concern for inequality, for social welfare, that had been part of kind of the global sort of, or especially the U.S. approach to the world, was concerned about development, was concerned about to some degree human rights in various contexts. I kind of fear that with this kind of erosion of these global norms, the erosion of American interest in it, we're going to see things just get worse. So that doesn't mean that's not a prediction. That's a sense that that's a real challenge that I think politics at the global level, but also at the international and local level, needs to mobilize, because only if Americans and Germans and French and Egyptians, see their issues like global health, public health, as an issue that's part of a global system, maybe there'll be a mobilization towards different forms of cooperation and rethinking the global system.
Mm-hmm. Milena, thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, I absolutely agree with everything that Dr. Hazburn just said, but I would just add that in terms of things that are perhaps not changing, and this is really a sad observation, if you will, is that in some countries where things were already dire, things are just as dire now, perhaps a little bit worse. But, in places like Yemen, for example, where there's been this conflict raging for many years, things were already really bad. And so, I'm not sure that the pandemic is really changing things significantly, maybe, making things a little bit harder for folks there. But, things are sort of relatively the same for people on the ground there. The one thing that might change is the sort of significance and power of the oil producing countries. So for example, Saudi Arabia, which is a huge oil producing country, we'll have to kind of see what happens with that, because right now we know that the oil prices are at a really all-time low. There really isn't as much demand as there used to be. The price per barrel has dropped significantly. And so we're going to have to see what that does to the importance and influence of Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Marshall?
I think that COVID is really just the sort of latest agent that's exacerbating all of these pre-existing sort of structural inequalities. Repression of minorities is just exploding, right, in places where, for example, Muslim and Hindu violence against one another, right, it's being used as a way of fomenting violence against the other group, claiming that Muslims are spitting on Hindus to try to spread the COVID virus, or all of these other sort of conspiracy theories that you see promulgated on Twitter and Facebook and other social media. And a lot of this sort of framing, this sort of, we're going to die one way or another, what difference does it make? If it's COVID or if I starve to death because I can't go to work. So in places like Lebanon and Tunisia and Iraq, you see protesters in the streets and they're saying, I'm literally, I can't go to work. I have no money to buy food for my family. I can either starve and die from poverty or I can die from this virus. What's the difference? And in places like Yemen, a lot of people say it's better to go out and die fighting the Saudis, right, than die at home of COVID or die in a hospital bed of COVID. So you see just sort of the ramping up of the intensity of conflicts and of intercommunal violence and of all of the sort of negative things that existed as structural realities for a long time, largely because of inequalities and poor governance, and of course, the legacy of U.S. imperialism, which we can talk about later as well.
Sure. Yeah. But first, Dr. Hazburn, maybe if you can expand on that point, are we looking at maybe two or multiple forms of this pandemic, especially thinking about the reality of what we've seen in quote unquote Western countries compared to what we've just heard about what's going on in the Middle East, we know that the effects of the pandemic are different, but it seems like the socio-political situation, it's a totally different planet for some places in particular. So maybe can you tease that out a little more about how different the experience is maybe in the Middle East compared to what we're seeing here in the States or other quote unquote developed countries?
Yeah, I mean, obviously depends by country. I mean, one thing is I'm not sure if we've seen this play out. Some of it's just because there's not testing. Some of it's because there's not the same measures in I mean, Jordan and Lebanon, different places have had policies, have had lockdowns, very harsh one in Jordan for a while. Iran also. I mean, there's been efforts to mitigate, but I'm just wondering, like, in the same way that in the United States we worry about the second wave, if across the region there is going to be a further wave. So I kind of wonder, like, as this plays out, and in places like Iraq, where I don't think there has been the same kind of mitigation efforts, what's going to be the impact, public health impact, in the next 6 months, year. So I don't, so we haven't fully seen this played out, especially in the places that have already had their public health system strained, or places that don't have good public health infrastructures, or where it's been privatized, so only a few can benefit. So I kind of, think this is happening at the same time as, like has been mentioned, economically, some of the main drivers of regional economies, like oil. So the oil states are going to have this squeeze on their incomes, which also squeezes the incomes of workers from other parts of the region in South Asia who work there. So they're being kind of squeezed. Issues like, tourism is also down. Destroyed. In the Gulf states, their aviation industry was also kind of like a key element of their economies, and so those have been like drastically shut down. So I think like I fear the mechanisms to try to deal with these challenges, like the resources aren't going to be there. There's going to be also maybe less Western aid for the countries that rely on aid, less funds from the Gulf. So I kind of feel like the real challenge is not just the immediate public health crisis, but going to be, I mean, many of these countries are very indebted. Lebanon is having a financial crisis at the same time. So they're trying to borrow more. Well, imagine the global economy where everybody's trying to borrow. What's going to happen to the international financial system? So these are kind of my worries. I think kind of like the next phase, the next year to 2 or 3 out, is going to be this major financial crisis, with the fear that a lot of institutions don't have the resources. So what happens when there's a strain on resources? The inequality just gets exacerbated. The ones that can survive find mechanisms to survive and try to limit the obligations to everybody else.
Milena, I wonder if you can talk more about the institutions and the mechanisms in place, because we have seen the post World War II institutions, the World Health Organization. We've got OPEC as well, playing roles in this pandemic. But I wonder if you can talk about, do you see them being strained in a new way by the situation, or maybe being exploited in a new way by some countries that we hadn't seen to this degree before this pandemic?
Sure, Tony. And before answering that, I would just add one more thing about the differences between the pandemic, perhaps here in the United States and some other countries. The whole concept of social distancing, which for us is relatively easy to implement, might be totally impossible to implement in some places. So, for example, in some of the Gulf states, like in Qatar, 85% of the population is basically the migrant workforce, and they live in very, sort of squalid conditions and in dormitory style housing. And so, how do you implement social distancing in a place like that? So I would just, the basic difference is, that whole idea might not be able to be implemented there. But to talk about the institutions, you mentioned, for example, the World Health Organization, obviously a very important organization. It is, sort of trying to do its best, but we have seen the WHO attacked by the US. President Trump announced that we would cut funding to the WHO. And in the United States, it's sadly become this political issue, if you will, where many on the GOP side seem to be attacking the WHO, saying that the WHO is in cahoots with the Chinese. There's the conspiracy theory that the Chinese basically created the virus in a lab and unleashed it. So we have seen a lot of pressure on the WHO from the US and perhaps from some other parts of the world. OPEC has had its moments as well. I mentioned earlier Saudi Arabia. There's been this battle of oil prices between Russia and Saudi Arabia that OPEC hasn't exactly been able to solve. Saudi Arabia has accused Russia of not being willing to implement, to cut down, to agree essentially to a limit on oil production. Saudi Arabia responded to that by basically dropping oil to the market at very low prices. Russia, of course, has accused Saudi Arabia of wrongdoing. So we haven't actually seen international organizations at their best. We haven't seen international organizations able to do much. And the one that you haven't mentioned is the United Nations. Arguably speaking, the Security Council, can seize itself when there's a threat to international peace and security. You could say that this is a threat to international peace and security, and yet we haven't really seen much happening at the UN level.
Why do you think that is? Just normal UN dysfunction or disagreement with the P5, the permanent five, or something new?
Well, I mean, I think in many ways the disagreement among the P5, in particular, the disagreement, long-lasting disagreements between the U.S. on one side and then Russia and China on the other, have been perhaps exacerbated by the crises. So things are more tense than before, and I honestly think that countries are focused on dealing with the pandemic within their own borders and are less engaged in diplomacy and trying to negotiate solutions together.
Dr. Marshall, normally we wait until the end for questions, but since they're streaming into my screen, I'll just fit them in as we talk. And we've got two questions which are kind of related here, and it's both about the widening inequality gap, I guess. Is the pandemic going to exacerbate the power differential between North and South, or developing and developed countries? Is this going to make the problems that we already have much, much worse?
Yeah, I mean, there's no crisis where the ruling class doesn't come out on top. And, you see the stories reported in the newspapers every day that, Amazon is making money hand over fist every day. All of the Small Business Administration bailout money went to these huge, major corporations with hundreds and hundreds of employees. There's no crisis that isn't exploited by people who have political and financial connections to the administration, the current administration in the United States, and that is the same pattern that you see in most other places. I would also say really that this crisis has, I think, in a way that previous ones might not have laid so bare, the way that the inequalities within the United States really mimic global inequalities also. So the conditions that you see, that we see in like prisons in El Salvador, we also see in homeless shelters in the United States, in migrant detention centers in the United States, in Rikers. The breakdown of supply chains and massive shortages that you see in other countries, we also see in the United States. Incredible inequalities in access to care that we see in the developing world, we also see in many, many, many areas in the United States. The crisis profiteering that you see, leaders, your own leaders spreading ridiculous conspiracy theories, right? So historically, you think about some of the conspiracy theories that were spread by African dictators about the AIDS crisis, right? And a lot of those, a lot of the new generation of African leaders are also spreading ridiculous conspiracy theories about inhaling, steam, 100-degree steam, so, sanitizing your lungs and drinking Hennessy, cognac, and that sanitizing your throat. So, but we also in the United States have our same, our political leaders spreading these ridiculous conspiracy theories. And you have the government sort of suppressing the number of infections and the number of deaths and not reporting on things. And, people who die in their homes aren't included in the official COVID death count. So all of the things that we criticize developing countries for are very clearly present in a large number of areas in the United States. So I think we'll see increasingly that I hope that Americans start to realize that that changes need to be made in our own society as well.
Zooming back out a little, Dr. Hazburn, another question here about international institutions. We've got the IMF, the World Bank. What roles are they playing in this? And is there potential for wealthier countries to further what the questioner said was a neo-imperialism in the Middle East?
I mean, I think it was mentioned, the idea that you would think that the United Nations would be, as an international institution, responding to the crisis. The economic institutions, I think they've been in a process for like the last decade or so of beginning to realize the limits of some of the previous policies of the IMF and the World Bank and the support for kind of market-based neoliberalism as an answer to questions of development. And so, there's a sense that kind of upgrading, rethinking of their policies really needs to happen very quickly now. And I don't know if they're ready in a position. The other thing is that a lot of the funding for such institutions have to come from donors, or have to come from a kind of collective, international effort that relies on states that have certain surpluses. And that kind of access to the surpluses might not be there in the same way. So I kind of fear that both on the policy end, about having the kind of policy strategies that are going to help to come up with a new form of development, at the same time as the resources just kind of might not be there. But they could play a role. But part of the way they gain direction is through the major donor states. So you need countries like the United States and Germany, and to some degree China, to sort of like give direction. And we don't have that kind of coalescing around a kind of a new vision for the global economy. So that's kind of what's missing. Without that kind of new vision and new direction, it's not likely that they're going to play a really transformative role. There's going to be states seeking aid in the same way, but how much can the global economy really sustain in terms of credit is going to be another problem.
And Milena, right away, I think about the power play that we saw with the WHO, where President Trump was blaming the WHO for mishandling this pandemic and threatening the funding, which is so vital. I think number one funder is the United States of the WHO. As of 2018, number two was the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Interesting enough, I just learned that. But I wonder if you can pick that apart a little more, this power dynamic of certain countries which can strengthen or weaken these international institutions kind of at a whim, it seems.
Sure. Well, so Tony, you already mentioned the 5 permanent members of the Security Council: the US, Russia, China, the UK, and France. Those countries have veto power in the Security Council. So the veto power is basically what you said. It's kind of like on a whim deciding to not allow something to happen without any justification. And so the 5 permanent members of the Security Council already have enormous power in the global arena. What we're maybe learning from the crisis is that many countries actually depend on each other more than they realize they do. So, for example, you mentioned, or somebody mentioned China earlier. The Chinese investment has been crucial in some areas of the world, in Africa and the Middle East. That is now not happening. So, with China kind of pulling back, it might be that the US or some other countries kind of want to move in, but at the same time, because of the strain on everybody's economies, they might not be able to, right? So we're going to kind of have to see how that dynamic among the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, how that plays out. And just to go back to your question about the IMF and the World Bank, if any good comes out of it, I think we're always looking for the silver lining, the positive effects. If any good comes out of it, it might be that the existing lending and development policies as applied to the global south are really not sustainable, because they trap countries in this vicious cycle of debt that really can last forever, right? So if there's any good that comes out of it, it might be that, we might have to rethink the entire global system of kind of lending and development to come up with policies that actually benefit the recipients of the aid, of the development, of the lending, without trapping them and creating these dependencies.
Dr. Marshall, I wonder if we can, even though we had a nice silver lining mentioned there by Milena, if we can go back to the negative. I'm sorry, but I'm very curious about exploitation of this pandemic, especially by autocrats. We saw that I say it this way, it seems like President Trump wanted to turn the screws a bit on Iran when Iran was very much being affected by this coronavirus early on. And I wonder if you can talk more about the potential for, or the existence already of the exploitation of the pandemic by certain actors.
Yeah, I don't do silver linings anyway, so that's a good question for me.
We'll try to get back to it later. Yeah,
I don't see them very often. Although, actually, to just derail that for a second, I think maybe the pullback of U.S. troops overseas from overseas military bases as a result of the pandemic may be a silver lining that we can maybe talk about a bit later. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly lots of actors that are trying to take advantage of the situation. I mean, U.S. sanctions have been a major obstacle to a lot of countries trying to put together a response to the pandemic, and it's a unique situation because it's not like we're just hurting Iran, or we're just hurting Cubans, or we're just hurting Venezuelans, because when the virus multiplies and spreads, of course, it doesn't observe borders, right? So the more people that are infected globally, the more the virus is going to spread, right? So if we're making it more difficult for Cuba and Venezuela and Iran to treat people with the virus, then we're making it easier for the virus to travel outside of those places and multiply. Certainly other actors are also taking advantage of this. You see, or maybe not taking advantage of it, but maybe actually even moving into the breach in some ways. A lot of people are praising actors, drug cartels and gangs in Central America and the Taliban and these other traditionally very bad actors for sort of stepping into the breach, while their governments are completely incapable of mounting a response and enforcing curfews and enforcing social distance and delivering food parcels and delivering medical supplies to people who are sheltering in place. So you see, I mean, I don't know what they're going to sort of do with that. I mean, they're certainly doing it, to preserve the lives of their own members, certainly. So it's in their own self-interest to do that. But when we come out on the other side of this, I mean, globally, there's already very little trust in formal institutions and very little trust in governments. And when we see that dynamic between these informal actors being present and being seen and being observed by people to contribute something positive to the response, and they see, the Brazilian government or whatever other government being, totally sort of paralyzed, when we come out on the other end of the crisis, that lack of trust and faith in formal governing institutions is going to be even worse. And I think that is sort of a root, sort of structural cause for a lot of violence in places all over the world. And so I think that's a really big factor that we need to look at, and is definitely, I guess, a black lining.
Well, we'll try to make it a little more silver later. But I'm not sure who would be best to answer this. Maybe Milena, we can start with you. But in the European Union, for example, you've got a number of countries who are under one banner right away. So you have multiplied research capability, but also just containment capability to a point, the limits of the EU, notwithstanding. But if you see certain countries kind of becoming lone wolves or more so lone wolves, and as Dr. Marshall, you mentioned that the virus doesn't care about borders. So by letting it proliferate somewhere else, it ultimately can come back to you. So I wonder, do you, Milena, think that the EU is in a stronger position maybe than the United States even, especially with our relationship with some allies and diplomacy in recent months past, especially?
Sure. So although the EU has, over the last 6-7 decades been unified on many things, including, has had a common foreign policy, when we think of the EU countries' responses to COVID-19, we actually see lack of harmony, if you will. So the two lone wolves that I would mention, the two countries that I would specifically single out are Sweden, which, as some of our listeners know, basically has not locked down, has not imposed, has not closed down restaurants and cafes, and has essentially encouraged citizens to respect social distancing without actually ordering it, if you will, from the government level. And that is in stark contrast to all of Sweden's Scandinavian neighbors, and that is in stark contrast to many of the other countries, like if you compare that to, for example, France, Italy, or Spain, where citizens have for weeks now been essentially not able to leave their homes much. In France, for example, you can leave your house, but if you leave your house, you have to print out this form, and it's like an official declaration of intent. What is the purpose of your outing? And if you're going for a walk or a jog, you can only go within a kilometer radius of your home, and you're limited to 1 hour a day. And the police is enforcing this very, very harshly. Now, the other lone wolf not lone wolf, but the other country that I would mention here is Germany. Germany has had a very, very good response to the pandemic, which many people attribute to the fact that the German hospital system in general is really, really good. They have many more ventilators, many more, other pieces of medical equipment more widely available. They also had testing available very widely, very early on, and were testing very aggressively. So we saw that their rate of hospitalizations and then ultimately the mortality rate is much lower than in other countries. And we actually saw Germany sending doctors and nurses to Italy and to Spain to help them. So I definitely think that Europe has not been unified in their different responses. And I'm not sure, if anything, I would compare it to the United States and the different states in the United States, because in the United States, we've also seen very, very different responses from state to state. So, I'm not sure that the EU will come out stronger than the United States. I think we're, roughly speaking, in a similar position.
It's great to see so many questions already coming in. But if you have questions for our panelists, feel free to text them 330-541-5794. That's the number, 330-541-5794. It's on your screen. You can also tweet them at The City Club, all one word. I'm trying to work them in as fast as I can. We have lots of them coming in, which is great. Dr. Hazburn, I don't know if you want to take this next one. It's actually about onshoring and economic restructuring, and whether or not you think that this pandemic might realign or restructure our supply chains to see more domestic capacity, both in the United States, but maybe also in other countries.
I assume you're going to see, and you already have sort of seeing this kind of trend. And even within the dynamics of, globalization, international political economy, there are different times and ways where there has been, relocating suppliers more locally in different sectors and different industries. So I think immediately there's a kind of, let's say, emergency sort of onshoring, like, can we find domestic suppliers? Can we shift production of these kind of products? So you're seeing that now. So what's going to be, how long is that going to go on? When is there going to be actually new investment? So one question is, at what point will there be a rethinking of production, or will it be kind of like, the collapse of this, communism, where it's like we have all this, plant, how are we going to use it to do something, to produce something new? So I don't know how quickly you could sort of completely like reorganize these supply chains. And also there's going to be a kind of cost to it, because many of these things have been, structured with very sort of thin supply chains that do a product here, ship it to China, assemble something there, ship it back, and how to reorganize such a product in a way that there's still going to be demand for it, people to buy. So I think, that becomes a real sort of business challenge. What kinds of things can be produced locally? It looks a little bit like the interwar period, where if you look at many different economies, Europe and even parts of the Middle East, where when you had a decline in global trade, or during the kind of Civil War, when you didn't have cotton being, exported, and you had from the United States, and you had other markets in Egypt and elsewhere, there is a kind of mobilization for domestic production. So are we gonna? But that's a kind of decades-long process of reorganizing the national economies. Are we going to see that? And I just think that's a kind of policy question, and I don't know how much there's going to be a clear, definitive answer and a clear, fully restructuring. And I think the EU is key about this. To what degree is the EU going to say our project was about integration, but this is like the worst kind of crisis for that? We might all have social welfare systems and public health systems, and we might cooperate in terms of technological development and things like that. But the vision of integration, of mobility, is like really being hit. So are they going to try to relaunch that, or are they going to like readjust, kind of like you had after World War I, on a more kind of national scale, national model, focus on national systems? The kind of production that you might have had at that time, that kind of small manufacturing, the technological base, was the kind of thing that might have been done within the national scale. But many kinds of products now have been based on drawing materials and technology and skills from specialized producers or cheaper producers globally. So that kind of reorganization would be a sort of a much more massive task.
Interesting. This is an aside, and I don't know if you have a comment on this, Dr. Hazburn, but I had seen that the UK secured PPE from Egypt. And some of the comments that I saw on Twitter, which is not the most authoritative source, but people were asking, why would a country like Egypt be supplying PPE to the UK? Don't the Egyptian people need that? And honestly, I didn't know even where to look for an answer about PPE supplies in the Middle East, and whether they had any stockpile that they could deal with their own crises before sending it off to the UK. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that particular case, but you have seen sort of like the fact that these things become marketplaces where there's a private investor who owns this. They can they get it's fairly cheap to export to market abroad, and so that maybe that's the there's a high demand and British can pay more. I mean, I don't really know the details of this question, but you've seen some of these kind of, in this moment, this kind of logic of the market sort of taking over supplies.
Dr. Marshall, we've got a very easy question for you, and I say that joking. The question is, how has COVID-19 exacerbated the relationship between Israel and Palestine? We know Israel, they've been trying to form a government, but how has that relationship shifted, if at all, during this?
That might actually be a better question for Walid. I think he focuses a little bit more on Israel-Palestine. But I do know that, for Gaza, which is basically, again, an open-air prison, when you have conditions like that and you can't get materials in and you can't get people out to get treatment at hospitals, even under ordinary circumstances for advanced cases of childhood cancer or any other sort of disease, it's going to just absolutely decimate the population. And I think that the way Israel always tries to really contain, especially Palestinians in Gaza, pressing them into, smaller and smaller spaces and making sure that they can't get through checkpoints, which are literally choke points where people are just piled on top of each other, waiting to get through. these are conditions where the disease is going to spread rapidly. I mean, when I mentioned earlier that there may be a pullback of U.S. troops from overseas bases in response to the COVID epidemic, maybe you'll see a pullback of Israeli military officials, IDF soldiers from different areas in Gaza and in Palestinian neighborhoods in the West Bank, where they're agents in the Palestinian Authority, because those individuals are scared of getting infected by COVID. So when there's a withdrawal of a repressive apparatus, because the individuals in that apparatus fear getting infected, that can also be a positive if people are able to engage in solidarity and help each other in the absence of those forces that were there before. That could definitely be a positive. But if Palestinians can't get access to basic medical supplies, and they certainly can't even under ordinary circumstances, I don't see how they're going to be able to manage this crisis in any sense of the term manage. So,
Dr. Hazburn, did you have thoughts on that?
Well, I would just add, I mean, one, Israel's having its own, political crisis, trying to form a government, has had 3 elections, might have a 4th. So they have those kind of internal issues. But one observation that relates to this case, but I think it relates to other cases, is the dynamics of this kind of pandemic leads to a dynamic of kind of isolation. So we talk about social distancing in a certain way, but also if you look about the relationship between Israel and the Palestinians, the dynamics of this kind of post-Oslo phase has been sort of Israel sort of pulling out in the sense of trying to sort of contain borders, separate themselves from the Palestinians, come up with these kind of strange geographies where you can have kind of bypass roads and different kind of walls and this kinds of thing. So the dynamics of I think the pandemic are not a dynamic that might lead to cooperative solutions and sort of engagement, but actually the opposite. And I think you're finding that in other places where the dynamics move towards individual isolation. People suffer the consequences themselves, not collectively, in the sense that each is individual. They're all going through a kind of a similar crisis, but the experience of each individual is defined by the individual, defined by the family. So you get this kind of fragmentation. And only if people can remobilize and say, well, is there a collective solution? Can we all act together? Can we all follow these norms? Can we all mobilize, mutual aid to help others? This kind of thing. Only if we sort of rethink it in that way can there be a kind of different politics. But many of the politics are moving more towards this isolation, separatization, each individual suffering the consequences and dealing with their own situation themselves.
Milena, a question here. I'm maybe interpreting it wrong, so maybe I'll ask it 2 different ways. But do you have thoughts on how the pandemic might influence populist movements and the rise of the far right that we've seen in so many countries? Do you think that these leaders in these movements might be emboldened by public health restrictions that have to be put in place? Or do you think that maybe there could be a counterwave against those far-right movements that so many countries have seen?
Sure. So, yeah, I mean, I definitely think that some leaders in some far-right movements are, have been trying to exploit the crisis to their advantage in places where authoritarian regimes already are in place. We have already seen, if you will, that kind of an exploiting of the crisis to impose more repressive conditions on various populations. So, for example, the Algerian government has imposed restrictions on people there, partially in response to the pandemic, but in a move that many have labeled as essentially repressive and trying to get rid of any political dissent. In Saudi Arabia, for example, we saw the tightest lockdown conditions imposed on this one region of Saudi Arabia, which is predominantly Shiite, whereas the rest, the Saudi leadership is Sunni. And so, people there have complained about that and have said basically, why are we under the strictest lockdown and not the rest of the country? And then I would say that even here in the United States, we have definitely seen the rise of populism over the past few years, but I do think that we've seen more and more protest against some of the restrictive conditions imposed by various state governors, we have seen protests from the far right. And, Tony, you're probably, I'm sure you cover this in your radio program, but there were protesters over the past few days at Dr. Amy Acton's house. Dr. Amy Acton is the head of the Ohio Public Health Department. There were basically right-wing protesters at her house with anti-Semitic signs on display, some perhaps armed, and that goes back to what Dr. Marshall said earlier, how we're seeing some of the same dynamics here in the United States as we see in other countries throughout the world. And I would say that definitely we'll see, as Dr. Hazburn mentioned, more isolationism, more restrictions imposed in minority groups, less engagement between governments with those minority groups. Think of, for example, Turkey, where there are millions of Syrian refugees living already. There has definitely been lots of pushback from the far right in Turkey against the presence of so many Syrian refugees. I think that's actually going to get worse as living conditions and economics become harder on everyone.
And what does this mean, Dr. Marshall, maybe for I guess grassroots change? Because if we have minority rights already being affected or further restricted, and we can't gather, we can't demonstrate, we can't mobilize in the same ways as before, what does that mean for the power of the people, I guess?
I mean, this has been sort of this has been commented on. I've seen lots of great articles online, right? That the left just isn't present, right? Because we're actually observing all of these norms and we're staying in our homes and we're social distancing. It's the right, it's the far right that's out in the streets and making themselves known and definitely taking advantage of the opportunity to control the narrative, to get themselves in the media, to be on television, and to be sort of the voice of people in the United States who really are suffering. I mean, you do have, in some respects, the complaints that they had, the grievances that they have are very real, right? I mean, people are really suffering. So instead of payroll payments that other countries are doing, the US government did a bailout for huge corporations. So the people that really needed the help are not getting the help. And that always results in a sort of a right-wing, revanchist sort of backlash. And that's exactly what we're seeing in the US. But the people on the opposite side of the spectrum, are basically trying to use, I guess, social media and online media to try to counter those narratives. But it's very difficult, I think, to do that, especially when you have, extreme right-wing state legislatures all over the U.S. That are supporting them, and you have families like the Mercers who are funding a lot of these sort of right-wing conspiracy theory groups. And you have organizations like ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council, that are funding all of these, these open the state, these programs, these campaigns to open the states back up, because of course ALEC is funded mostly by large businesses, and they want the U.S. to open back up because they want to continue making money. So all of the agents that are present and most powerful in this current moment are on the far extreme right, and it's. I mean, I don't know. Honestly, I don't see a way forward, really, other than through the ballot box, I suppose. But I mean, that's a whole other, I think that's a whole other conversation that you'd have to have at a later date.
Yeah, challenges abound, and especially in a time like this, that there are so many moving pieces. Like you said, Dr. Hazburn, we're still in the middle of it, I guess. One of the questions here is one that, even though we question the existence of silver linings, is there good news? is there the potential that the pendulum could swing the other way, that we're looking at conflict between oil states, we're looking at Russia flexing its muscle, we're looking at instability in a number of countries. Is there any silver lining, or is there something that could happen which would make us feel like we're all in it together? Hashtag all in it together. Dr. Hazburn, maybe if you want to start.
Well, I think there only can be a silver lining if we imagine there to be a possible silver lining. So let me say, the idea that people can mobilize and rethink and say, well, everything from the system, the international or the liberal international order and the system of global governance to the healthcare system in the United States, are things that seem like are failing in this context. And not responding. So I think, we can rethink those and say, well, this is a time to, think in much more radical terms. I mean, you could read about people talking about nationalizing the airline industry or the defense industry or things like this, or the oil industry, energy, are thinking about radical solutions. So I think there is a moment where people can open up and say, well, what kind of different types of organizations, what kind of norms, and I think this is one thing that because of the withdrawal of the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, there has been a kind of decline in that kind of debate about a broader debate within certain segments of the public about what are some ideas to rethink the structure of the American political economy, or at the international level, the international order. And I think we need to have those conversations, and only by having them and rethinking will there be a possibility for that path forward, even if we can look around us and say, well, it looks like it's all going in the other direction. We have to keep in mind that we can imagine a different possible alternative, and then you could have a cascade, kind of like with the Arab uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and so forth. You can't have a cascade of people imagining, well, let's go in that other direction, let's try it out, let's come up with a mechanism to have a debate about it.
Milena, any thoughts on that?
Sure. So, some silver lining. So first, just a small kind of, fact. We've been talking about the Middle East. One country that we haven't talked about a lot is Syria, which, Syria has certainly been in the news a lot over the last, several years. In March, I just read this the other day, in March, in Syria, there was the lowest number of civilian deaths in many years. And perhaps that is because of, I don't want to say like distancing, but sort of a temporary halt in the conflict, in light of COVID-19. So perhaps in some countries, some areas of the world, there are sort of small temporary positives in the sense that the conflicts are on hold. I mean, it's not a long-term silver lining because nothing has been resolved, but perhaps temporary halt. In terms of other silver linings, I would just mention, perhaps the idea that this entire international political and economic order doesn't work. We talked a little bit about the Security Council, the United Nations, the P5, the permanent members of the Security Council. The idea of the veto power really doesn't make much sense. If you think about it, it makes no sense to say that one of the permanent 5 members can, for no reason whatsoever, just decide to halt a global action that everybody else agrees on, is a good idea. The fact that our international development, lending, policies, economics, that doesn't work really well at all. That basically since decolonizations, many developing countries have been stuck in this cycle of debt forever, so that needs to be reviewed and kind of rethought about. And then I would say on the more domestic level, perhaps there's something to be said about the role of government and the existence of social safety nets. We saw that, when people in Germany are told you can't work, they don't panic, and they don't panic because they can get unemployment benefits, which equal about 85% of your salary for, sort of an indefinite period of time. Perhaps not indefinite, perhaps it can last for 10 years, but certainly it can last a year. In the United States, people get at best $1,200 in a one-time, payment. And so, many people in our country are desperate to go back to work because they don't have any other source of income. And so perhaps there's something to be said about the appropriate role of government in every domestic society.
Dr. Marshall, any thoughts? I know you were anti-silver lining earlier, but I'll give you a chance.
I think all of those everything that's been said is an excellent case. Rethinking the welfare state and sort of trying to revive that. And if you can get business leaders basically to agree to that, which they did, of course, during the New Deal, because it was to their own benefit to agree to those policies, that would be great. The issue is you're going to have to start actually taxing those people, right? So earlier when we were talking about the Gates Foundation being a huge funder of the WHO, right? One human being shouldn't have so much money that he can single-handedly fund a major international organization, right? Not single-handedly, but be a major source of that funding, right? I mean, these people need to be taxed, and their money needs to go to the government so that the government can provide programs, including elements of the welfare state, Social Security, unemployment, better hospitals, better schools, all of these things. And until we realize that we need to totally redo the tax system in the United States and actually, start collecting taxes from people who have been evading them for decades and offshoring and everything else, we're not going to be able to pay for any of the programs that everyone is going to agree we need to have when this crisis is over. And we can point to them all that we want and say, this would have helped, this would have slowed the spread, this would have done this. But if we don't have buy-in from the business community, and especially from the finance community, which is where most of the money is, then we're not going to have the funds to actually do that. Another great silver lining would be shrinking the defense budget. And I think that might also be part of the narrative going forward, especially the response to the flyovers, the Blue Angels flyovers, and people saying, how many masks or ventilators could we have gotten in exchange for that, show of for the air show, the flyover show that the Pentagon did to show support for frontline coronavirus workers. So when society starts actually asking questions like that and presses on their elected officials to make those kind of dramatic fiscal changes and those dramatic economic changes, I think then maybe we can start to move towards something better.
A pretty good try for silver lining. Thank you for that. Thank you all so much. I have a little script to read here, but this was a fascinating conversation. Thank you all for being here. Thank you everybody who tuned in for this first virtual Happy Dog. Happy Dog is a collaborative effort between the City Club of Cleveland, the Cleveland Council on World Affairs, the Happy Dog, and we hope to be back there soon, the Northeast Ohio Consortium for Middle Eastern Studies, and IdeaStream. The City Club virtual forums are sponsored by the Cleveland Foundation, the George Gund Foundation, Key Bank, Nordson, and PNC. Additional support from Bank of America, the Char and Chuck Fowler Family Foundation, and Thompson Hine, and many more generous members, sponsors, and donors. You can find them all at cityclub.org/thank you. I hope you do keep in touch and find us all on Twitter if you have more comments. I tried to fit in as many as I could, but thank you again for tuning in. I am Tony Ganzer, and our forum is adjourned. Thank you.